Good afternoon, everyone. We're just letting people in, so could you just give us one more minute to make sure everyone's in? Mel, is there anyone still in the waiting room?
No, you can proceed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Mel. My name is Phumzile Ncube, and I'm a researcher here at SARChI Industrial Development. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Prof. Trigena to today's edition of the SARChI-ID webinar series. Today we've got Dr. ILAN STRAUSS presenting on, sorry, my screen's just frozen. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry, presenting on who will police generative AI. Lessons from the private armies who patrol the internet for copyright, CSAM, security, and crime. Dr. Ilan Strauss is Program Director of the AI Disclosures Project at the SSRC. He's a visiting professor here at SARChI Industrial Development and an honorary senior fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, where he was head of digital economy research on a multi-year Omidyar network-funded research project. Dr. Ilan was the joint recipient of an economic security project grant investigating big tech's acquisitions of technological capabilities. He previously taught macroeconomics at New York University at the Division of Applied Undergraduate Studies and at Rice University at the Jones Graduate School of Business and has consulted widely for United Nations bodies. His work investigates new theories of harm and competition in digital markets with an emphasis on big tech's digital platforms and ecosystems. Ilan is also the recipient of an economic security project grant looking at the role of acquisitions in big tech attaining dominance in artificial intelligence innovation. Previously, he taught macroeconomics. Sorry, I feel like that's a repetition. He holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York and an MSc in economics from SOAS at the University of London. Ilan, you can take it away. You can share your screen and get started. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Phumzile, and thank you very much for having me. And to all those who are attending on Friday afternoon in Johannesburg or Cape Town or wherever you are, I appreciate that. Are people able to participate, by the way, in terms of the chat, or is it like one of those locked
Yes, they
Zooms?
can. Yes, they can. I think, yeah, everyone should
Fantastic.
be able to type in the chat. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Darn, it's hard to see the chat when I present, but anyway, we'll do what we can.
It's all right. I'll take the questions for you also from the chat,
Great.
so don't worry about that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If you see anyone, because at times I will encourage some participation.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, so greetings everyone. I'm in Brooklyn in New York, and there I run a small research project with someone called Tim O'Reilly, and it's called the AI Disclosures Project. And our focus is basically on trying to understand how these new generative AI products are being deployed. So the actual products, not just the models, and asking what are the use cases that they're being used for on the various platforms, and based on actual usage of these products, what are the risks that we should be trying to mitigate for. So that's what we do, the AI Disclosures Project, and we have a blog called Asimov Addendum, and our research is available at the Social Science Research Council, which is a think tank who houses our research, the SSRC. So here's the title of the talk: Who will police generative AI? And by generative AI, I'm talking about ChatGPT and this new generation of AI, which is predictive, and it could be for text or images, video, sound, and based on all of this data which they ingest for their training, or really their pre-training, they look for correlations in this data, and then they can generate a bunch of stuff. So that's the focus of today's talk, these generative AI models. Now, here's kind of the argument in a nutshell, and which we'll be going through today, and we'll see what we have time for. And I apologize that there's so much material, talks should generally try to avoid presenting too much. But the argument today is that if we want to understand who is currently policing generative AI, and maybe who should be policing it to stop a lot of these harms that we see occurring, which we'll go through now, we first need to understand how digital markets work. So digital markets are layered networks whose behavior is set by open protocols. Protocols are the rules that govern how things communicate in digital markets. However, the internet's rules today are set by private companies that own a lot of the evolving internet's core infrastructure. So those are the cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, DNS providers like Cloudflare, and then the applications that run on the internet, which are kind of services. So, for example, Facebook, you could say is one, or Amazon, like shopping or WhatsApp. And then mobile browser and all the various kind of ways we interact with the internet, which are called user agents. Sorry, it turns out that there's some construction in my neighborhood. It looks like I need to get my headphones. Sorry about that. And then we're going to look at the commercial incentives that drive the behavior of these actors. And then we're going to try to explore ways forward, which is to ask, can we devise a new set of protocols or rules for these markets? Pumzile, can you hear, by the way, the construction? Shall I go get my headphones?
Not at all. I can't hear anything.
Can't. Okay, great.
Mel, can you hear
Good.
anything? Yeah, I can't hear anything. Yeah.
Okay. So that's what we're going to be going to today. And here's some recommended readings, which this talk is kind of based on. Tim O'Reilly, Lawrence Lessig, who wrote a book called Code is Law, and Robert Burgeon. I'm probably mispronouncing that name. So we also need interdisciplinary work on the internet and AI if we're going to think about how to ensure that these companies are not the only ones, a narrow set of companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, if we're to ensure that it's not just them capturing all the value from generative AI, and it's actually other companies who are also able to benefit from this amazing technology. I'm an economist myself, so I'm sure I'll make some errors today because we're going to be focusing on the internet. We're not going to be covering commercial arrangements, which also help enforce norms and standards. And very often that can lead to something that's, a mutually beneficial exchange. Obviously not every market that arises is going to like benefit everyone, but very often it can. So for example, Google search created this bargain with all the content creators on the internet. And Google search, they kind of took over from what existed before them, like all these portals like Alta Vista or Yahoo. And Google search said, we're going to crawl and index every website on the internet. And all the websites said, fine, you're allowed to like send your bots to crawl and index us to know what we're about. But in return, you got to send us traffic. People who are then going to go and click and look at our sites, because that's how we're going to make money, right? Through that traffic. Because once you're on our site, there's going to be an ad, and then we're going to make money from that. And Google will also make money because they're going to share in the ad revenue. So that's like an example of a mutually beneficial exchange, or something like Spotify, right? Or Apple Music, whereby they took over from Napster, which was illegal file sharing of music, if you're old enough to know Napster. And Spotify created a market for music where people now, instead of downloading music illegally, they pay for high quality music. And in doing so, they help ensure that content creators who create music can get a share, right, of every music stream. Whereas previously, if you downloaded music, nobody got anything. So these kind of mutually beneficial arrangements are going to be central to AI. We're not covering them. So policing Gen AI, we're talking about markets here. But if you read most of what people are writing on Twitter or the latest scientific paper, they usually aren't talking about markets. They're talking about models. And that's because everyone who's leading the discussion on the harms from generative AI, they're computer scientists. They're people who are coming from a particular background. And there is some sense to focusing on the model because that's upstream. So it's like, well, if you stop all the bad stuff happening in the model, maybe all the, you know, what comes later down in the products will be safe. But unfortunately, that's not really how it works, because what these companies are deploying is more than just a model. It's a model with tools and data. But fundamentally, harms come from markets. That's the premise of the talk today. Firms compete within markets in order to sell their products. So ChatGPT is now in a competition with a bunch of other companies to sell the best product. And what economists call market structure, different market structures, incentivize firms to compete in different ways. And so you could have a very concentrated market structure, you know, where two firms compete with one another in a healthy kind of way. You know, like, I don't know, maybe it's healthy how MTN competes with Vodacom. Or you could have a very unhealthy market structure where you have a single firm, you know, who just dominates the market. Like, I don't know, telecom for landlines or something. And that market structure can lead to a bunch of harms because it's very concentrated. So competition is good, it incentivizes innovation, but it can also, especially on the internet, be quite opaque, be potentially ruinous, and it can involve exploitative modes of monetization. So, for example, designing products that are very addictive. You know, we all spend way too much time scrolling around the internet now, right? Because they've designed their products to be addictive, just like they regulate casinos. But a lot of this, the digital monetization is not regulated. So digital market structures are often winner takes most. So one firm like Google Search, you know, might win out, or Instagram, or TikTok. And this leads to what Cory Doctorow calls enshittification, which is basically these digital platforms degrading the quality of the platform, you know? So before, you used to go on Google Search, or you used to go on, I don't know, Instagram or YouTube, there'd be no ads, and you'd be able to get the results you wanted. Now they're going to shove a bunch of stuff which maybe you don't want, but the platform can make money from. So this is what policing, I would argue, generative AI is about. It's about policing the nature of competition in these markets and ensuring that competition can benefit everyone. And by everyone, I mean the consumers and also the other firms who are kind of reliant on these tools, right? Because not just consumers who are using ChatGPT or Google's Gemini or Anthropic's Claude, but it's also producers, right? Other third-party firms are going to use those products through what's called the API, the application programming interface. And there's a bunch of harms, right, which we see happening. But again, these are not like theoretical harms. These are harms we're actually seeing. So the companies are making AI quite addictive and persuasive because that is what might lead to greater user retention and keep people on the platform for longer. So there's a company called Character AI, where you can interact with different AI characters. And they used to boast that the average person would spend hours on the platform, and they've had several suicides linked to people using their platform. They were bought by Google because one of their key software engineers left to start the company. Then there's also releasing products which are unsafe, which, you know, in Silicon Valley you call moving fast and breaking things, right? And that's OpenAI's product called Whisper, which is great transcription of voice to text, and it's used in hospitals in America, and it saves doctors and nurses a ton of time, but it also hallucinates, according to one study, in 1.4% of cases. That might not seem like a lot, right? It's like 1 in 100. But, you know, there's millions of transcriptions, and when it hallucinates, it has a tendency sometimes to just fill in like random words, but sometimes it'll actually just insert plain old lies and make up information about the patient. So that's a move fast and break things risk. And then, you know, there's a bunch of stuff where these companies might be incentivized to allow these models to not have any guardrails. So Meta, when they kind of release an updated version of their chatbot on, I think it was on Facebook itself, but maybe it was on Facebook and Instagram. Excuse me, the chatbot was allowed to engage in sexual role play and chit chat with its users, including minors. So they didn't have any guardrails on that. And then OpenAI, their image generator called Sora. It's really great. You should try it. And initially they were like, you know, we're not going to allow you to generate images of famous people. So if you typed in like someone famous, it wouldn't, generate an image of their face. If you said Beyonce, they're not going to make an image of Beyonce, but now it will, because it means that more people are going to use it. So again, they have a commercial incentive to maximize usage, but that commercial incentive might clash with some of the goals we have for society. So then the question is, okay, there's a bunch of harms that these companies are doing, right? And so surely, who has the power in these markets? Surely it's these companies that have actually developed I call them integrated model developers, because they make the model, but then they're also making the product too, right? Like a chat bot, let's say, interface, such as OpenAI and Anthropic. So surely they're the ones who have power in these markets. And so they're fundamentally the ones who need to be policed, right? Or, like we need to just put regulations in ChatGPT because they're the ultimate deciders, right? Or look, who knows, maybe it's Microsoft, because maybe like you use Microsoft products and Microsoft are going to embed AI into everything. So, maybe it's about policing Microsoft, since these are the companies with the largest they have the power in the market, right? Well, today I'm going to actually be arguing that I think these companies have a lot less power in these markets than we think. And instead, I'll propose that these are the sorts of companies who can be doing the policing. And I don't know if you recognize these logos, but there's AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, which, even though it was created in America, it was actually built out of Cape Town. And then next to that is Facebook, and that's like a downstream platform where AI gets applied. And that's where you're going to see a lot of the actual harms manifest, because that's where all the usage is, right? And one of the largest usages of AI, generative AI today, is on advertising on Facebook, and allows advertisers to make ads like images, text, and it helps with the automation of the whole process. But we have no visibility into what's going on Facebook on the impacts of AI. And then you have Cloudflare. Cloudflare are a DNS provider, and which is like the phone directory of the internet. And they're actually the ones policing generative AI today. And then you have Visa and MasterCard, payment providers, right? They kind of run all credit card payment processing around the world. They're the ones policing generative AI. And then that is the App Store, Apple's App Store. So Apple and the app stores and the old platforms which had power on the internet, they're policing generative AI today. And then Google Chrome, and that's an example of a user agent. Just like you might access AI through mobile, the other main way you're going to access AI is probably, unless it's on your machine, your laptop locally, is going to be through a browser like Google Chrome. And so I'd argue that these are actually the gatekeepers who have the power and to police generative AI, and they already are. And in the absence of government regulations, companies become the policemen. And the thrust of this talk is also that even if governments regulate, the internet has rules built into its code, into the protocols. So when governments regulate, it often is ineffective, or it's kind of too late. The market structure is already established in the code. So who's the power in digital markets, or these digital networks? Because that's the key thing. That's what they really are. They're networks. All our computers or mobile phones are connecting to the internet. So it's these gatekeepers. And why they're gatekeepers? Well, I'd argue they're gatekeepers because they have external observability. So that means that they actually have data on what's going on. So like Facebook actually has data saying, well, what's the impact of generative AI and advertising on our site is leading to more clicks. Whereas someone like OpenAI, if a developer is using their model, they're not really going to have, or they shouldn't really have, the visibility into how users, are actually, what's the impact of people using their model downstream, So if like Facebook integrates ChatGPT, onto its platform, the visibility is really with the application. So where it's applied, which would be Facebook. And there, ChatGPT won't really have, OpenAI won't have the visibility. And gatekeepers can set rules in a binding way. So for example, OpenAI might say, well, we're going to say the age limit to using ChatGPT, or Google say the age limit for using Gemini is, let's say, 13 and up. And you're like, oh, well, they're the gatekeeper. But actually, no, because let's just say the primary way that people are using your application is through a app store. So on mobile, that means that your age limit is not set by OpenAI, it's going to be set by the app store. So even though companies have terms of service, those aren't always the binding terms of service, you know? And then lastly, gatekeepers, you rely on them, right? There can't be good alternatives or any alternatives at all. So you have like very few options. And so in that way, people argue maybe these companies are almost like digital infrastructure. Maybe that's a stretch. But I think for me, the perspective I kind of want to adopt is one of a network. And in a network, there's no single point of reliance usually. Sometimes there can be, but networks are really complicated things, right? Like all these students at UJ connecting to the university as a key node, that's a network. But UJ doesn't have exclusive power because there's other universities maybe you could go to. That's another node, right? And then you have a government node, which is a regulator. So in a network, there isn't usually a single point of pressure or reliance. And I want to argue that the different layers which make up the internet mean that regulating it can be done from so many different pressure points. There isn't necessarily a single point. Just like there's not always going to be a single point through which we access AI, right? We might use our phones to access AI, or we might go on our computer. So those are different points of access, and so different points of regulation. First, we need to understand the network better. And I apologize if I'm going over what you already know, but sadly, in high school and at university, I was never taught about what the internet actually is. Whereas surely that should be essential reading, just like we learn how to read and write, different languages. Shouldn't we know how to read and write the languages that are widely used today, which is code? I guess, so here's a bit of history. And this is explaining the network. And you need to understand the network if you need to understand who has power. The internet is the plumbing layer of how we access AI today. So the internet is the underlying network infrastructure. It's the plumbing. And it's a global system of interconnected computer networks that runs on a standardized set of rules. Those rules are called protocols. And the internet's the plumbing layer that enables data to flow between any of the devices connected on the internet worldwide. And it's actually a network of networks that moves data, and it splits the data into these IP packets, internet protocol packets, and routes them across independent networks that all are speaking the same language. And that language is the internet protocol suite. And that language basically dictates a common way of devices speaking to each other and transporting these data packets. So importantly, within this, foundational layer called the internet, protocols are the rules. And protocols are rules for networks. And protocols determine how devices communicate with one another. And in doing so, protocols allow for what economists and others call interoperability. And interoperability is the ability of different devices to speak to each other on the same network, right? So the fact that like I can buy an Apple phone and somebody else can buy an Android phone, and they can make phone calls on the same internet and still speak to each other, that's interoperable, right? And that already, if you think about it, creates a healthier market, because it's saying, well, not only one type of device is able to talk with that same kind of device. That's an example of a protocol determining interoperability in the network, and that in turn saying you can have more devices connected to one another. Now, the next layer on the internet is called the World Wide Web, and that's the content layer. So that's how we access content. And that's an application that runs on the internet. And originally, it was just a system of interlinked, what's called hypertext documents. Now it's resources, more resources, and they're accessed via your web browser, for example, or now mobile browser using the HTTP protocol. And so that HTTP protocol That's the one that's going to help load all the content via websites. And so the web is an information sharing layer built on the internet that links resources, HTML page, a PDF, etc., with URLs, like www.facebook.com, and it delivers those via the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. The internet is like the highway system, while the web, this content layer, all the cars, trucks, and traffic that use the highways. So this is the content layer. And if you think about the genius of the web, all these protocols, made it possible. So it's full of rules, because protocols are rules, but the rules were such that the internet was permissionless and decentralized, as Larry Lessig notes in his book Coder's Law. And what do we mean by permissionless and decentralized? Well, it's decentralized in that, anyone with a device that is abiding by the HTTP protocol, right, and running a web browser, anyone can connect up to the web. You didn't need to apply for permission to use the web. You didn't have to get a login password. It's true, you needed first like an internet service provider of some kind, right? And you needed the basic infrastructure and needed the computer. But anyone could kind of join. And moreover, anyone could create, right? You didn't have to ask anyone's permission to create a company on the web. So for example, Facebook started only because it didn't need permission. All it needed to do was it needed to start a site, www.facebook.com. It didn't need Apple's permission because it wasn't making an app, right? It didn't need Google's permission because it wasn't making an app for Google's Play Store for Android. And so the internet is, the web rather, because we're talking about the content layer, the web is permissionless at its core. And that's also why ChatGPT didn't start on mobile, right? Because to start on mobile, you need someone's permission to be in the App Store. No, ChatGPT first started on the internet. And arguably, that's kind of been the greatest breakthrough of the company. It's that they started a point of distribution, a point of access that wasn't reliant on Google search. It wasn't necessarily reliant on Amazon, for visibility or any gatekeeper like Apple. And so fundamentally, the web is permissionless, but it's built on these open protocols, this open set of rules that everyone kind of agrees to. And there's so many examples of these rules, right? Like email. So email clients, TCP, IP, and these email clients will also be built in these open protocols. And that's why Gmail was able to come about and challenge Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, and it offered a superior product. But again, the protocol didn't stop a single company from winning, right? Like if I had to poll people in this room, what email are you using? Chances are you're going to be using Gmail. And maybe you're going to be using like some Microsoft email, right? Outlook, if it's like some professional context. But, despite these open rules, which are permissionless and which allowed anyone to innovate, somehow the market still tipped, right, to one or two winners. So it's no guarantee that the market will remain competitive. But at least with the protocol, there's a transparent set of rules that they're agreeing to in terms of how, what the data is going to look like, how they're going to transport that data, and the transparency around those data flows. And there are other layers in the internet. There's so many. So one which is relevant for us to know for today's talk is the DNS layer, the domain name system. And I'm told that this is the internet's directory service. And so at its core, that's translating human readable domains. A domain is like facebook.com or like uj.co.za, and it's translating that into rootable IP addresses. So it can actually land up accessing the relevant information. And so Cloudflare, turns out they're a major DNS provider. They handle 25 million HTTP requests per second. And they serve over 20% of all the websites in the world. So their network capacity exceeds many countries' entire internet infrastructure. They're run by someone called Matthew Prince, I think it is. They're going to come up again. Then there are high-level layers on the internet. So again, the internet and the World Wide Web as the content layer on top of the internet, a bunch of applications or services land up getting built on the internet. So Facebook's an example of one of those applications or service. So is Google search, right? And these applications landed up like becoming their own walled gardens. So the protocols, even though these companies use them every day, they were built on top of them, but they land up building their own rules pretty much, right? So, they have like Google has all this data on you, right? From Google Search and Gmail and Google Maps. And Facebook might have all this data on you from Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, Shorts, iMessage, Facebook Marketplace. So these services land up kind of erecting their own rules because there weren't any which would penetrate their services. So they decide how to use your data. They decide how outsiders can access their platforms through their own private APIs. So these higher layers actually made the World Wide Web into a permission space where you need permission to innovate. So if you want to innovate on the basis of all the data Facebook has, it's not permissionless. You need them to give you access, and then they're going to give you very partial access to some of their data or some of their tools. And a similar thing you could argue for Google. You need permission to build upon their services through their APIs. And then finally, these are layers, but the access layer is very important, right? So if you're accessing the internet through a browser versus mobile, that's very different. So mobile is heavily permissioned. And in fact, when mobile came out, Facebook didn't think it'd be a big deal, but it turned out to be a big deal. And they had to change their entire business model and their entire product because Apple said, actually, we're not going to allow you to have all these, let's say, games and third-party developers being built into the app. So that changed the whole business model. ChatGPT starting the internet on mobile. And there are other connecting layers like payment processes, advertising networks. So those are all very important. So now I'm going to, in the next 10 minutes, so I'm going to go touch over, I apologize, because I do really want to hear from people. Here's some of the examples now of who has power in these markets. And again, it's a network, right? So there's so many different ways to put pressure on the nodes in the network. So the first question is, who decides on the age limit? Who decides on who's old enough to use AI? So, a naive answer, and that's a clip from The Matrix, which I love. A naive answer would be, well, every company is just going to set their own age limit, right? Because government hasn't set age limits. But that's the naive answer. Well, because other companies, they also need to access networks of distribution, whether it's the internet, whether it's mobile. And that means that there's certain rules they're going to have to play by. So take character AI, which is highly addictive, in which everyone says there should be strict age limits on. So character AI have their own terms of service. And the terms of service for accessing character AI via its website was 13 years plus. Maybe it changed it because it's going through tons of lawsuits. And then if you want to download instead the app on Google Play, right? That's the Google-owned app store on Android. It's also 13 years plus. Small detail is that Google owns character AI, which means it's going to have an incentive in having a lower age limit, right? Because it wants more usage of its product to make more money. Now, Apple doesn't have any ownership stake. And as it happens, Apple says the age limit is 17 plus for character AI on its app store. So it's interesting how these different private regulators have different approaches. And similarly, who decides on the age limit for ChatGPT? Well, OpenAI's terms of service, right? But is that really where it ends? No, because a lot of OpenAI, a lot of ChatGPT's usage is via the App Store. So all that usage, which is via the App Store and not via the World Wide Web, those apps are actually going to decide the age limit of ChatGPT. And then what about, how are companies accessing ChatGPT? Well, they don't access it through the front-end interface, like we do. They're going to use the back end, right? Because they might want to send millions of queries and they want a more programmatic interface. So they're going to use what's called the API, the back end. And they might access the API. Chances are they're going to access it via a cloud provider of some kind, right? Because OpenAI hasn't built out its own cloud infrastructure. So if you're a developer, you want to ask ChatGPT millions of questions, you're going to use the API. And that means you're going to use a cloud provider like, so you're going to ask questions via Microsoft's cloud because that's who ChatGPT have been partnering with. So the age limit for ChatGPT, if you're a developer, is actually set by Microsoft and Microsoft's Azure cloud, right? Because it's the cloud layer, right, which all these models are running through. And so these cloud layer, again, they become the de facto regulator, and they're the ones who have, considerable power here because their terms of service and their tools which they have to police the cloud are really sophisticated, really developed. They've been around for ages. So who decides the age limit of ChatGPT? The short answer is it's complicated. It depends how you're using it and who is using it. And if you're a developer using it via the cloud, if you're a consumer using it via mobile. So again, in a network, there's so many different points of access and points of regulatory pressure. Second example, how to catch these big tech and big AI companies from training on content which they don't have permission to train on. And that isn't just copyright content, right? When someone owns the content and has a legal intellectual property claim to it, like the latest Avengers film. It could be your own content, like you have a website or you have like a research paper, and then they trained on it without permission. How do you catch these companies? Well, the private armies are already catching AI, and that's how we have these court cases. And I always wonder, how do these companies catch you when you download a movie illegally? Maybe like you use UJ's network to go online, you download a legal movie. How does like the film company, Paramount or Amazon, like how do they know you download that film illegally? It's the same way which Strike 3, which is one of the largest, or at least they're a major porn studio. They make pornographic films, Strike 3, and they have hundreds of brands. So how do they catch Meta? So Meta is the company that owns Facebook, that owns WhatsApp, that owns Instagram. How did Strike 3 catch Meta from illegally training its video model on its entire pornography collection and allegedly catch them? Because the court case is just happening. And here's the allegation. The allegation that Strike 3 made against Facebook is that using the BitTorrent protocol, because BitTorrent is actually a protocol for anyone who downloads stuff illegally, the defendant Meta is committing rampant copyright infringement by downloading our works, their porn films, for the purposes of acquiring content to train its Meta Movie Gen large language model, as well as other Meta AI models. And if you read the court document, it's fascinating. Meta is actually now one of the largest distributors of pornography because Meta itself now distributes these porn films through the BitTorrent protocol. So that's also quite funny, I think. So how do they catch them? Through, I'm just going to call it adversarial connectivity. So basically how it works is that, the film studios like Paramount or this porn company Strike 3, they're going to sign up to the same kind of torrent sharing as another peer, and they're going to pretend to download the file or help then in turn upload the file. And so they're just going to like act like another person coming to download something, but they're then going to be able to record or harvest every IP address that shows up to download the film. And then after that, there's legal tools, which they can try and use to kind of do some sort of enforcement. So they're then going to go to AfriHost or MTN, the ISP providers, and ask them to kind of send you a warning notice that you download something illegally. But basically, it's companies showing up and pretending to be another person trying to download something and connecting to BitTorrent. That's
sorry,
yeah.
Sorry, we've got 5 minutes.
Thanks. So that's adversarial interoperability. And there are other examples, right, where you could like try and use software for your own purposes, like ad blockers, even though that's slightly different. Next, who will decide the rules for online pornography? Well, it's actually the same people who will design the rules for generative AI. So, funnily enough, online pornography, which is one of the largest sources of internet traffic or World Wide Web traffic, there's actually a list of hundreds of rules around what's permitted in online pornography. And there are even rules, for example, saying that only certain types of vampire sex is allowed and other types of vampire sex is not allowed. So who decides those rules? It's actually Visa and MasterCard, which is crazy to think about it, that Visa and MasterCard land up becoming the regulators for so much commerce and so much of traffic on the web. How? Well, Because if you want to monetize your traffic on the web, if you want to like sign up to a website, if you want to download something and make a payment, chances are it's running through Visa and MasterCard and now also Stripe. But globally, something like 80% of all payments, credit cards are running through Visa and MasterCard. Maybe that number changed in the last 18 months. It could be. So who are the people who are deciding which generative AI companies should be kicked off the internet? And especially generative AI companies for image generation. Because with image generation, you can do like deep fakes, and you can also do child pornography. So who's policing that? Because the internet, right, we learned it's decentralized and permissionless, right? So anyone create a website. And unless, you have like Cloudflare, the DNS layer, or an ISP provider kicking off that site, it's got to then be somebody else. And turns out it's the payment network. It's the Visa and MasterCard. So payment processors are actually deplatforming. They're kicking off a lot of these companies, the generative AI image companies, from their networks. And the moment they kick them off their network, these companies then have to change their actual rules, not just what it says on paper, but what they're doing to prevent users from abusing their AI products to create, all this kind of illicit generative imagery. And then lastly, who will save the internet? Because the internet is actually under attack. And I don't know if you know, it's dying. And it's dying for lots of reasons, but one of which is that the grand bargain of the internet, which Google set, which said that we're going to crawl and index all your sites, and in return, we're going to send you human traffic, because humans are going to be clicking on links, and humans are going to be looking at your site with eyeballs, and then those content creators are going to make money from eyeballs through ads or signups. That no longer happens today. So this is data from Cloudflare. And the graph on the right-hand side, I asked ChatGPT to put in log scale. So that's why it's compressed. But on the left-hand side, you can see that Google in the middle of the stack has a crawl to refer ratio of 9.4 to 1. That means that Google will crawl and index 9.4 websites, and in return, it'll send, let's say, like one user to visit a website. So it's not bad, right? That's why websites allow themselves to be crawled and indexed by AI, by these bots. Then take someone like Anthropic. So Google has a 9.4 to 1 ratio. Anthropic sends its bots to read over 70,000 websites. And in return, it's going to send one click from a user. OpenAI, 1.6 thousand to 1. So more than half the internet's traffic now is just bots, but these bots are not sending anything back because there's not adequate citations and there's not a market yet to say how they're going to, remunerate. So instead, they're just, it's like colonialism, they're basically just without permission coming in and consuming all these resources. Now, in theory, the cloud providers could investigate some of this because it violates the cloud provider's terms of service. So Perplexity at one point were under investigation by Amazon, but the cloud providers want to remain neutral because they're like, we're important infrastructure, we got to be neutral. This isn't our job to police. So instead, Cloudflare, the DNS layer, on July 1st said, you know what, we're actually now going to police all these bots because nobody else does and there's no rules. So we're going to become the de facto regulator of the internet. And they say they are now going to allow websites to block all bots by default. And they've even set up their own protocol for a payment system, such that a website can choose either to refuse a bot or to demand payment from the bot before it visits its site, if the bot wants to scrape it. So if ChatGPT wants to come to my site to find an answer about economics on something I wrote, I can choose to, on my website, in code, say, you can visit my site if you pay me 100 Rand. And then it will say, fine, gives me the 100 Rand, takes the information, it uses that to spit out an answer. But again, a private company has now decided this for now. And this is, it's great that there's a change, but it also means now that Cloudflare has power, and Cloudflare can become potentially the next gatekeeper, right? Taking a cut of all the payments that flow to content creators. So in conclusion, we have a need to architect markets, not necessarily from government, but built into the market itself, from the bottom up. And that's the idea that code is law when it comes to digital markets. And in particular, we've looked at protocols, which set the rules of the road. And these protocols are built into the market itself. And in doing so, it becomes much more effective than any, government law. And I'm reminded of, a lot of the transport infrastructure in Africa, which was built to go from the center to the coast. And that's because it was just built to extract resources, right? Gold, diamonds, you dig it up, you send it to the coast. And that infrastructure, in turn, helped shape a lot of the economies. And that's why we have to build digital infrastructure, including the rules that govern it, like protocols, which ensure that the rules are not just for pillaging, but to ensure that it's a permissionless system whereby anyone can access it, and whereby one company like OpenAI or Anthropic can't capture all the value from the market. Yeah, so thanks very much for entertaining this talk. I try to be a bit provocative, and I'd love to hear what people think. Yeah, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ilan. That was very thought-provoking. I've got lots of thoughts in my mind, but let me first give the floor to, to other colleagues to see if anyone's got questions. There are some comments and a question in the chat.
Oh, great.
So Elizabeth says, the vocabulary of international law and of the protocols of justice, how to teach kids and the youth. And Joanna says, great talk, thank you. Do Visa and MasterCard ultimately regulate because governments insist they do that? Or is it purely consumer pressure? And I had I guess, a question also around, what Joanna's talking about. And it's like, what are the incentives of policing, right? Before we got to the DNS, you mentioned all the different platforms or whatever that have been, effectively policing, what the generative AI is doing. But what have been the incentives? They don't seem to be altruistic, in my view. And, these court cases can go on, but I feel as if as soon as they get what they want, quote unquote, the generative AI follows their models, they may stop policing, you know what I mean? And we may end up in a situation where we still have our data being mined or, for teaching these AI models, stuff. So yeah, I guess you can. Elizabeth, I see you've unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Please go for it.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can. We can hear you.
Okay, so quite simply, what I heard now and what I've heard in many of these discussions is that this is systemic, and it is governments, protocols, international law, systemic stuff. But, Ilan, in the end, the generation who has to make decisions for themselves are people who are currently at high school or university, and specifically at primary school, and they just don't know enough. And so the type of information, Pumzile, that they need has to go to schools. We as academics and researchers and pontificates, we can say a lot, baie gepratery. But let me tell you, we need to get to the kids. What do you say about that, Ilan? Wat dink jy?
Yeah, I think I wish I had learned a lot of this in school too. And it's important, like you note, that how to integrate law into this. And there are official bodies, standard-setting bodies for the internet and the World Wide Web. But it's fascinating that, and this is quite an American approach, when it comes to the internet and these digital markets, they're so complicated that the complications have to be ingrained in code.
Exactly.
And so even if you have an official body setting law, it's often ineffective. And what might win out is what lands up happening in the code and the algorithms itself. And policing that code or those algorithms can be very complicated. It can be done, like in America and Europe now, they're finally going to regulate the app stores of Google and Apple. The companies often find a way around it because, online there's so many different things they can do. But yeah, how do you integrate this with international law? I think is important. But definitely very challenging. The other points raised, Visa and MasterCard, interestingly enough, their initial entry into this market, some people would say, well, there's now regulations that hold them liable if they repeatedly and knowingly allow for illicit content, for them to be processing illicit content. But I actually think it's often up to the whims of the CEO. So, for example, it was the CEO of Bill Ackman, an activist investor, called the CEO of MasterCard, said he was horrified to read in the New York Times of all the online pornography happening on the internet that MasterCard and Visa were processing. So he called up the CEO. He was really pissed off and he said, I'm going to do something about it if you don't do it. And so then, after Bill Ackman, the rich activist investor, called up the CEO of MasterCard and Visa, can't remember which, I think it was MasterCard. MasterCard then told the main pornography internet websites, you got 24 hours to take down all of these videos. And it's pretty much the largest content moderation that the internet's ever seen overnight for that period of time. So literally overnight, something like 1.2 or 12 million or whatever it was videos were just like removed from the pornography websites. And now they get a lot of pressure from activists, investor groups. Yeah, and I think Phumzile's point is really the fundamental point, right? Which is that these companies are doing it ultimately because they have a commercial incentive to act.
Exactly.
Or often to not to act. Same with Amazon and its cloud service, AWS, which so much of the internet runs on, like when you load a Netflix video. So they have an incentive to remain neutral. But those commercial incentives and thinking about structuring them in effective ways is still quite powerful. John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, he had the concept of countervailing power. And so he said, if you've got like this big corporation, economists will say, well, the solution is lots of competition, like lots of little firms need to compete with this big corporation. But Galbraith said that's just not modern capitalism. If you have a big corporation, you need to have something big on the other side. So like a trade union, he said, as an example. And so in some ways, what we're seeing are these different corporations go up against each other due to the commercial incentives as countervailing points of power. But then their own commercial incentives land up taking over, right? Like we might see with Cloudflare, who's trying to police the internet. So it certainly has limits. And that's why you need rules built into the markets to ensure that no individual company's commercial incentives can override this public good, or in the case of the World Wide Web, this kind of public content ecosystem, which feeds everyone. If one person tries to kind of take the whole ecosystem and leave nothing for anyone else, then we're all really worse off. So those commercial incentives clearly do have limits.
Can I quickly jump in for the last moment?
Okay, sure.
But still, the kids in high school.
Elizabeth, why don't we, because I just want to make sure we hear from everyone. So why don't we chat afterwards, if that's okay, Elizabeth? Can we take other questions?
Yeah, I just want high school kids to know what you are saying. Thank you.
No, I hear that. But let's just take a few more questions, just because there's a lot of people on the call and everyone wants a turn.
Sure. Rex, thanks. I'll come to you now. There's another question from Nicholas in the chat. He says, do you think we'll be able to retroactively apply new laws to current AI companies? Will we be able to reimburse internet content creators for the theft of their content by big companies to train their AI and make humongous profits, perhaps via profit sharing? Rex, you can unmute and speak.
Sure. Thanks, Phumzile, and thanks, ILAN, for such interesting content. I mean, it does spark up a lot of questions and debate about the role of technology, basically, and how its evolution should be monitored and policed, even in applying that to policy in different sectors, primarily also, not just targeting productivity, but basically the ethical aspects of this. My question is, do you see a solution that is centered on education and training, particularly for, for people in Africa or developing regions, when much of this control is by, large corporations and oligarchs that are in the West, who may not put the interest of those in the developing regions first? And while you think about that, I mean, for Africa as a developing region, I'm still trying to figure out how we benefit using a technology-based industrial policy, right? It's one thing on the one hand if it affects, the up and coming generation, but for what we have now and the extent of awareness, do countries need like a AI specific policy that says you can apply it to this extent so long as it improves your productivity? Anything beyond that can be detrimental, you see. Yeah, so those are my questions. Thanks so much.
Sure. No, these are great questions. They're tough, and Nicholas's point in the chat, it's like, well, yeah, if you take them to court, maybe something will happen. But again, the argument is that there should be arrangements built into the internet, whether it's commercial arrangements or it's protocols, and new protocols, which ensure that you don't have to take someone to court in order to get your kind of fair share of the profits here. And then, it's a great question about what's the way forward, and should Africa as a continent have a technology policy? If so, how much is it relevant? I think that anything which is going to allow, countries in Africa to compete better in global markets is important. And I think that means staying abreast, keeping up with all the latest technology, that doesn't necessarily mean that every country in Africa should, make their own version of ChatGPT, because that might be a waste of resources and they might not be competitive in that. But it doesn't mean that everyone needs to be fluent in the language of computers, in the language of the internet, and increasingly, also in the language of statistics. But we don't all have to know how exactly these models work. That should be part of the education, right? Just like we learn to read and write at school, we should all know how to read and write code, even if at a very, basic level, to have an understanding of the code that these models might be built on. So I think that's important. Governments can lead the way in ensuring that countries are getting sufficient value. So the South African government could pass a law saying that for Uber and other delivery drivers of food, or other Uber, Lyft, other car delivery platforms, maybe there's a certain tax that is applied to them, right? Or certain minimum wage standards which are applied to these drivers. So government can lead the way when it comes to regulation. Yeah, some countries, especially in Europe, are now trying to create their own competing national champions. So like Europe's like, oh, we're going to make our own model, and then maybe in like Russia and Turkey, they used to have their own competing delivery services, right? For like food, just like South Africa also might have its own competing delivery services, like Mr., at least in Cape Town, had their own competing one. But yeah, so you can try to create your own competitors, but it just depends if that's how you want to invest your resources and time, and if you think that is a way which can ensure that the wider economy best benefits, But either way, as the world gets richer, more and more of our consumption goes to services, right? We'd like to eat out more, we like to go on holiday, we like to watch and buy content, and we like to have help with our cognitive work. And that cognitive help comes from algorithms like Google Search, and increasingly it's going to come from AI. So if that's the way the world is going, that's certainly something that we should all look to, as workers, be competent in, right? And then as economies also look to be to use to make us more competitive in whatever it is we're doing.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks so
you.
much.
Oh, thanks so much, Ilan. Are there any more questions? I know we have run out of time, but does anyone else have a burning question that they'd like to ask? Yes, no? You can raise your hand if you've got a question.
I'm also happy to stay on. I'm sorry I spoke for so long.
No problem. Does anyone else have any questions? I have just one brief extra question, Ilan, about, the moving from permissionless, how these companies, build on these permissionless platforms and then go on to be gatekeepers, once they've started making money. Is that something that governments should be regulating to protect the internet, so to speak, right? Because at the end of your talk, you said, we need to protect the internet, yes, from AI bots, but also from this, the platforms, the way they operate after they started generating a profit, or they want to, protect their profits.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We just wrote a piece on it actually yesterday, so I'm just posting it in the chat. It's on this AI newsletter called AI Frontiers. Yeah, and I think one of the important things is to try to break down these walled gardens, these fiefdoms that each company has erected, their own castle, and to get in or out, you got to you rely on access to the castle through their API, which is called the app. That's the application programming interface, and it's just a structured way of exchanging information and talking to the platform if you want to access the data or services. So there needs to be efforts to try to make APIs more open. So in Europe, it's come from the state down. So in banking, in the EU now, to encourage competition in banking and to allow all these like new fintech startups to exist, they say that if you're a big bank in Europe, you have to make available your core banking data and your core banking services available for free to any firm who wants to access it. And that's the rule, and all the big banks hate it. And that's why there's all these new fintechs in Europe, because the gatekeepers there are forced to offer their APIs for free. And in America, it's been a bottom-up model. The government hasn't mandated anything like that. So instead, there's been a private API standard, which has been set by the market, which in banking to this private standard allows for the secure exchange and access of information, again, to accredited third-party developers. And importantly, it's always on condition of the consumer agreeing to give some of their banking data. So it happens a lot in America. I can't remember if it's like that in South Africa, but I might, let's say, like open up my bank, like Standard Bank or something, and then it'll say, do you give your permission to share your banking data with this third-party app who's going to help you maybe budget better, or who's going to help you make monthly payments? So that's an example of the bank then opening up their API to a third party with your permission. So in America, it's come from the bottom up. In Europe, it's the top down. But either way, we need, I think, target and consider these APIs. And if they are essential infrastructure, is that something government should regulate? And can they regulate it, given the complexity of all these services? They're so different, all these digital services. Like Slack is different from Gmail, is different from Google Maps, and what each API provides as essential data or services. So it is tough for governments to regulate. But with banking in Europe and America, we see that progress can be made in kind of forcing open these like essential gatekeeping services to third-party developers, third-party firms, who can then use the data and some of that banking infrastructure to create a competing product, or to at least be in the market.
Doesn't that have issues with privacy though? Or aren't there privacy issues related to that?
It has huge issues. Yeah, there are huge privacy implications, but that's why, number one, the consumer has to give their consent. And number two, you have to have levels of encryption to ensure that that data is secure. And I think what we see in terms of consumer behavior is that consumers are happy to give over. It's a biblical story. They're going to give over their data for like a bowl of lentil soup if they're hungry. It's the Jacob Esau story. They're going to give over their data for like a little scroll on TikTok. But instead we got to ensure that security is built into the system. Into the actual API, into the network itself, which, with OAuth and stuff, it increasingly is. But yeah, Phumzile, you're right. Without trust that your data is going to be used responsibly, you're not going to share it, right? So if you want to have these more permissionless markets, data security is clearly going to have to be like one of the key protocols which underpins this new internet, right? And there is something called OAuth, which is emerging or has emerged, which helps with that.
Sorry, I forgot to mute myself. Thank you so much, Ilan. That today's talk has been very, very interesting. I'm sure people have questions, but the internet, as you said, and generative AI and all of the stuff is actually quite complicated. It's not really something that you can just have at your fingertips. I mean, you had to break down literally what the internet is for us at the beginning of the talk. Can people reach you anyway? Can they email you? If they have
that'd
questions?
be great. I'm sorry that there was more time for questions. There's my email, ilan@aidisclosures.org. And again, you can also find our stuff at, so here, for example, is our blog, which you can sign up to, which you can also communicate with me. I'd love to hear from people and to continue the discussion.
Perfect. And thank you so much for giving us your time. I know it's a bit early on your side. And thank you to everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We will release you to enjoy your Friday. But before we go, please do look out for our events that are still coming up in August. They'll be on our social media and our emails. And then in September, we've got the Rethinking Economics Festival for Africa. Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival, in conjunction with the Institute for Economic Justice on 5 September 2025. So please look out for your emails and on our social media for details of our upcoming events. Thank you so much once again, Ilan, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Have a lovely weekend.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, bye.
Cheers.
Yes.